Hello and welcome to Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. I'm Scott.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Peter.
So a couple of weeks ago, Andy Ngo, the columnist from Quillette, who earlier in the year was attacked by Portland Antifa members, but that's not what I want to talk about today. Andy Ngo actually got suspended from Twitter temporarily. He is back now, I believe, but he was suspended for a few days because he stated some objective facts about the murder rates of specifically black transgender people. And I forget who it was in response to, but somebody on Twitter, a progressive, had brought up the fact that I think like maybe 20 black transgender people have been murdered this year in the United States. Andy Ngo's response to this was, well, you know, if you actually look at that statistically, that's not a very high proportion. It might actually even be lower than the proportion of non-transgender people. He said that most of the assailants, and I think this is maybe why they temporarily suspended his account, he pointed out that 85% of the assailants in these cases are also black. So if you're saying, as this person was saying, that, you know, black trans people are being murdered by racist, transphobic thugs, that's not the case. And he was pointing that out. He got suspended from Twitter. And I think they only let him back onto the platform when he deleted the tweet. I think that was the condition on which he would be brought back. And so what I felt like was being established there is very similar to what happened to Megan Murphy a while back, a trans-exclusionary feminist who said that men aren't women. That was a tweet she posted. She said, men aren't women. And she got banned permanently from Twitter. So that got me thinking about tech censorship and freedom of speech. And also the way that we view objective facts, such as the fact that men are not women, and the fact that 85% of the assailants in black trans women's murders are in fact also black. And so the motivation is clearly not racial. And so I wanted to ask you guys this week, what does it say about our society that basic facts aren't being agreed upon? Like the reality where these statistical facts are being considered hate speech, where Andy Ngo says 85% of the assailants are black. This is a statement of fact. It is a statistic. And he gets suspended from Twitter. And he's not allowed back on until he deletes it, until he deletes that fact. Basically, the fact is the problem, and it's not allowed on the website. Does that say that our society is basically living in two completely separate realities? Like, are we really at the point where it's just like people aren't living the same life? Like they are in, like, someone's in a simulation and someone's not, or maybe they're both in simulations.
Well, I think it's much more than two realities. I think we live in a plethora of realities, and you know, people can pick and choose their facts, right? So they can say, I am basing my decisions based on these facts, but they're excluding other facts that might contradict or, you know, lend less support to, say, the ultimate conclusion that they want to reach. And, you know, I think you can use reason and rationality and facts chosen very limited basis to justify some really terrible things. So I think part of maybe the deeper problem is just that it's kind of the Wild West out there in terms of these tech companies, and they're pretty much allowed to do whatever they want, and they have all of these competing pressures with regards to they have, you know, say, people who are advocating genocide on their platforms in other countries, and they need to figure out how to deal with that.
They have ISIS recruiting videos popping up.
They have ISIS recruiting videos, and it's like we don't have good regulations, good guidelines. We don't know how to handle this, and so this kind of form of mob justice is really what you're talking about in terms of that it's the mob.
But clearly, the answer isn't to ban someone who states a fact about, you know, crime statistics. And so the question that I feel like I'm trying to get to is like, yeah, you can understand why tech companies feel pressure, especially because they're trying to attract advertisers. I mean, YouTube has had, I think, 2 different adpocalypses, as they call it, because they lost billions of dollars, billions with a B, in ad revenue. And they had to completely revamp their monetization systems, much to the chagrin of creators. They've killed entire genres on YouTube by revamping the monetization system to meet the needs of advertisers who justifiably don't want their ads to show up on an ISIS recruitment video, but they also might not want their ads to show up on a Steven Crowder video, which is obviously a far cry from ISIS recruitment.
I think maybe the difference that I see between your position and my position is I have no expectation of fact on the internet, right? It's for me, Twitter and YouTube are more potentially about entertainment rather than education. And no doubt there are facts and it's educating. But if they want to censor it and say, you know what, this isn't a factual place, this is a fictional place, just like Netflix, then I mean, they're private companies, and until we change that, from my perspective, they can do whatever they want because they're not bound by the same restrictions that
they can, but they shouldn't. I mean, it's bad for the public discourse, and I know you're not necessarily disputing this. I don't think you would, but I just want to go in the direction of like they can suspend Andy Ngo for stating a fact. They can suspend Meghan Murphy for stating a fact, but they obviously should not. That is not good for our public discourse. It's really bad for our public discourse to say that certain, like basically we're not going to have a fact-driven discussion. We're going to have an emotions-driven discussion. So when you state a fact that makes me feel bad, I mean, this just gets to the whole Ben Shapiro thing. You know, facts don't care about your feelings. It just gets to the point where if that's the way the discussion is going to be had, you know who that's going to favor. There are strong emotions-based arguments that you can make, definitely emotions-based, in favor of social justice, ideals. Namely, I mean, exactly what happened on Twitter with Andy Ngo, which is somebody pointed out like 20, black transgender people have been murdered this year. That tugs at your heartstrings to hear that 20 people got brutally murdered, and that the implication is that they got murdered because of their gender or identity or because of their race or a combination of the two. But the facts don't reflect that. And at the end of the day, the facts are what matters, because we shouldn't prioritize that issue because of the facts. Like, your emotions say, oh, we got to do something about the murder of these trans black women. But the fact is they're actually not being murdered any more often than any other group, and that the murders that are taking place aren't motivated by something that we can stamp out, like, alleged transphobia and racism, which is the implication of the notion that they're being murdered to begin with and bringing attention to it. And so I'm just concerned, like, I understand what you're saying, Peter. It's like you don't expect Twitter and YouTube to stand up for facts. But I want them to, and I think we should all want them to, and we should try to create a new system. I understand that the system as it stands, they don't have to put facts over feelings. But I want there to be, let's call it the Ben Shapiro, reformation of social media, where we say that, like, you can't ban someone for just stating a fact. I guess, and it would disturb our more libertarian-minded viewers if I said that the government could play a hand in that, but I'm open to it. I mean, just because somebody has to keep our discourse free and open, and there is a constitutional basis for it. It's called the First Amendment. And I know that, yes, the First Amendment doesn't necessarily apply to private companies, but maybe it should, because they have a huge, huge impact over our discourse now, and they're making it worse.
So I would agree with that last point, and I think you're optimistic in the fact that, or by stating that these institutions can be reformed to be more fact-driven. I'm far less hopeful of that. And as I see them sort of imploding due to all of these competing challenges, I mean, I say good riddance. Like, I don't want our public discourse on Twitter. I think it's a terrible place to, say, conduct foreign policy or engage in policy discourse. It almost prevents discourse in a lot of ways. So from my perspective, yeah, make it all about feelings. I don't care. I don't want that to reflect how we run and organize our society.
But what if I framed it less as reformation and more as regulation? Like, I almost am getting to the point where I want to make these companies. Like, I want to say, look, let's make you a utility now. And I'm kind of stealing this from, of all people, Elizabeth Warren. But I have very different motivations than she does. And I almost want to say to these companies, I'm not 100% on this. I'm willing to hear out the other side. I know any libertarian listeners are going to be like, no. But for me, I'm leaning towards the government could maybe step in and say, look, if you have content that does not violate the law, you got to keep it up, because it's called freedom of speech and it is the basis of our society. And you're such a big entity. Google is arguably bigger than the government. It controls the information that flows to us. When we want an answer, we don't go to mom and dad anymore. We go to the internet and we go to Google. That company has so much power, it needs to be regulated. because it's deciding what we see and what we don't see and what we believe. And if they're going to do that, I think that we can regulate them and say, you know what, you're not going to cherry pick what I see to fit your political agenda. We're actually going to make it maybe illegal.
I would shift the conversation and the way we're talking about it. And this is a difference of opinion that we're all going to have. And that is, I think we should frame it as a rights issue versus a responsibilities issue. So I think that these companies do have the right. And so I take the more, I guess, extremist end of free speech and advocating that they can make these bans and these sort of flippant or what might seem unnecessary regulations of private regulations on their platform. But they have that right to do it. It's the social or moral responsibility of those content creators and owners and the people who run the platform. Everybody has a responsibility to each other to maintain a kind of free speech friendly atmosphere, right? Now the question becomes, of course, as we've been talking, how do you prevent a monopolistic enterprise?
How you make people actually take on that responsibility, because they're not doing it.
Well,
they're intentionally being derelict of that responsibility. I mean, they're not just going like, oh, whoops, we're not doing a great job. Mm-hmm. They're intentionally doing this.
Yes.
I mean, they have no intention of taking that responsibility, as much as I like to think that they would.
Well, then if we talk about public utilities, I would point out our current public utilities, which, maybe there's an argument that you can't have those regulated or operated outside of state control, but often they're inefficient and they themselves are subject to abuse as well, right? Price gouging, with Comcast or other internet companies, and you often don't have much choice in terms of what you're going to get. And often people see this as a relic or some kind of legacy version of what we can get on the internet.
Yeah, so, but the one good thing you get out of these utility companies, like say BG&E or whatever, just water and electric, is they're not going to shut down your services because of something you said that they don't like. Like BG&E, like Crowder, one day soon, Steven Crowder may have his channel deleted from YouTube. That's not out of the question. And one day after that, Dave Rubin may have his channel deleted from YouTube. They're just going to keep going. Jordan Peterson, all of them. That's totally within the realm of possibility. I don't really see within the realm of possibility in the near future Steven Crowder having his electricity shut off, because there's an understanding that he is entitled. Generally, people understand that those they disagree with are entitled to this utility that is water and electric. And it sounds iffy to say that someone is entitled to their presence on a social media platform. Like, it sounds wrong. And yet, I'm like, it's the new frontier for speech and debate and discourse. And you are entitled to be a part of that discourse in the United States. That's the basis of freedom of speech, is that everyone, regardless of the content of their opinions, has an equal right to speak. No one can be silenced. And the new frontier for that type of discourse is social media.
So I think you make a very good point there. And I would like to emphasize the words "in the United States." And I think this is where the utility model breaks down, because the power companies in the U.S. aren't providing power to foreign governments. They're not providing power to, say, potentially enemies of the U.S. in, say, the Middle East, or creating censorship platforms and technology for people in China. So I think at a certain point you can say, oh, well, just make them utilities and everything will be okay. But you can't unilaterally give, say, freedom of speech to the rest of the world without also creating the responsibility for using that speech well in the rest of the world. Because then, you look at the election interference report, so much of it was just Russia buying ads, creating memes, spreading them on Facebook. Should Russia have the right to do that on our utility? Absolutely not. If it is a public utility and not a private company, we need to defend our national interests and prevent these foreign actors from abusing our freedom and our openness to divide and conquer us.
I think it's a good point, but I want to play devil's advocate, and it's going to be a tough one. But because I'm almost going in the direction of, like, I'm going to try and explain why maybe, just maybe, under very specific circumstances, Russia should be allowed to commit a certain level of trolling. So, and I'm going to use that word to start, trolling, and we can work our way up from there to, like, election interference, because you can view it as two different things depending on what specifically we're talking about. So if Russia, if some Russian nationalist who just hates the United States let's say he's non-governmental to start, this first guy that we're going to talk about, this hypothetical, ethereal Russian nationalist dude. If he wants to troll the United States and post a bunch of fake Black Lives Matter, fake white supremacist stuff just to sow division in the United States, I think he should be able to do so. It's like, if you want to troll people and convince people of things that aren't true and lie, that is legal. Now, I think the interesting question is, what if he's a government actor? What if he's an employee of the Russian government? He's in the KGB and he's doing something that clearly is... It's like psychological warfare. I mean, he's actually like, it's literally a government effort to sow division in the United States. It is election interference. It's no longer really trolling at this point. I feel like you could create, I think this is a good point to bring up, because I feel like in the system I've devised, you could create fail-safes and regulations for this type of activity. You could say that there are some very clear exceptions, like espionage, like election interference, where these companies could take unilateral action that, even if I'm maybe sort of saying that there should be a system where they can't ban someone unless they violate the law, and I'm taking it to that extreme level, that if you have a Russian troll or a Russian state actor that wants to take advantage of that freedom, maybe there could be an exception that's made. Particularly, I think it would be easy to write in, like, government actors are going to be treated differently. If you're a foreign agent, right? We have laws about foreign agents. If you're a foreign agent, you maybe shouldn't be allowed to make political content on YouTube.
Yeah, but you have no idea who is. I mean, it's all anonymous. Yeah. The accounts can get routed through wherever. I mean, it's almost an impossible problem to solve, both being open and not being censorship.
Is it though? I don't like who.
According to that report, it was very, very effective.
Duped by these fucking.
But it's not
Russian trolls.
But here's actually the thing, and I think this is what a lot of people understand. It doesn't need to work on a lot of people in order to swing certain counties. Because
the election was decided by like 30,000 votes.
You need to swing just a relatively small number of people, and part of it is it's kind of at the margins, and really it's probably taking people who are like pretty close, maybe had some of these ideas, and then just pushing them over the edge. So really, it's not like, oh, somebody was just a totally reasonable person and got totally blindsided. I've seen that happen to a few people, but it's usually people who are kind of, on the fence. Maybe they're kind of loners. They don't really have a lot of friends. They don't have like a social circle to keep them reasonable. And they find a bunch of stuff on the internet, and maybe it's created by a foreign actor, and it kind of pushes them into the madness land of whatever conspiracy theory.
But I feel like you're allowed to present conspiracy theories and propaganda. Like, you're allowed to lie. Like, lying is something that I would allow. It's like, because as soon as you make lying against the rules, then they're going to start deciding who's lying and who's not in a very politically motivated way. Like, I don't know if there is a method where you can say, okay, we're going to get rid of the Russian trolls, but not the Dave Rubins. Because Dave Rubin is telling the truth and the trolls are lying. I think it has to be all or nothing. And honestly, I'd like to keep the Dave Rubins and the Stephen Crowders and the Jordan Petersons. And then maybe some Russian troll convinces 20,000 people to vote for Donald Trump. I don't know. Those people are kind of fucking stupid. Like, I'm sorry. But if you see some Occupy Democrats or some stupid fucking meme about Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, and that sways your whole election decision, the Russians didn't really have their work cut out for them, frankly.
Yeah, and it's such a dubious area as well. It's difficult to track this, as you were saying. The overcorrection would be setting up laws to overcorrect a situation that you have vaguely, kind of vague reports from intelligence agencies as to how much influence that they're catering to certain audiences or sowing division, right?
How much could they possibly, I don't know, because it's like, I mean, like, even if you post a bunch of divisive memes, you're still posting things that exist within the U.S. consciousness already. Like,
but they did things like they made fake
news articles.
They created fake Facebook events for white supremacist rallies, so that then real counter protesters would come, and then they'd get a few. So it was actually quite. It was actually quite.
Sophisticated.
It was very sophisticated. I mean, they're pretty smart people over there in Russia.
So they created fake.
And I think these are the challenges that the tech companies are facing, where a lot of the things that we're talking about now, where it's like, well, you can do this and you can do that, but then you get rid of people like Dave Rubin, and it seems like right now they're erring on the side of getting rid of people like Dave Rubin because they're so much more afraid of, say, allowing any foreign espionage
Well, I think they don't like having Dave Rubin on because I don't know if it's really connected. I think that these companies genuinely, to give them some credit, they genuinely don't want Russia interfering in our elections. They don't really see the upside of that. And they also know that it's a concern of the public. But to give them less credit, I don't think that is part of why we see them censoring people like Steven Crowder and Dave Rubin and Tim Pool and Jordan Peterson. I think it's two completely different motivations, one of which is a decent motivation and one of which is not.
So what you were saying kind of reminds me of what people have been saying about Tulsi Gabbard, that she's an unwitting Russian agent.
That's right.
Yeah, and she found that very offensive in saying that, I'm a former, military veteran. I think I should know when I'm going to be used in this way. And maybe, we're not always aware of that. But I think the better emphasis, again, is whether the domestic issue is more important or the foreign interferences. And I'm going to lean on domestic. I think that's a far more critical issue. As crazy as that might sound to some people who might be listening, I'm not sure what the IDW audience is, if we care very much about foreign policy.
I'm going to defend you in a second. I actually think you're right.
Okay. Yeah, so I just think that, and again, if we're talking about domestic, to your point, Peter, obviously there's a division occurring, and if the Russian trolls are contributing to that, then that is a factor that I'm not throwing away or not saying that's important. But rather, I think that the battle must be domestic and local and more on a responsibility or social responsibility level than moving towards legislation.
So what you said about, like, you would consider yourself maybe more concerned about election meddling by Google than by Russia, essentially?
Well, when I said domestic,
I
meant specifically the banning and censorship or the kind of arbitrary practices against people who have alternative views.
Yeah, which I mean is chiefly coming from Google and Facebook.
Correct, yeah.
So in saying that, and I said I wanted to defend that position because I think you articulated it very well, in that, look, for every person who voted for Donald Trump because of Russian propaganda, I bet you there's 10 people who only vote for Democrats because they've never seen a Dave Rubin video or a Tim Pool video or a Jordan Peterson video or a Steven Crowder video, because those videos are systematically repressed and suppressed. That has a much greater impact. I'd say if there's 20,000 people in the United States that specifically you could figure it out on the dime, like they voted for Trump because of Russian propaganda, there are millions of people who would not be voting for Democrats if they were exposed to any alternative ideas. And if this same woke narrative, the woke supremacist narrative, wasn't drilled into their heads by social media platforms that suppress any alternative viewpoints, that has a much greater impact than Russian election interference. Really think about the number of people that if you sat them down, you made them watch Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin for a little bit, they'd probably be like, oh, you know what, maybe I'll vote third party this year, or maybe I'll even vote for Trump. Probably not. Probably third party, because that's me at this point. Like I've gone from pretty hardcore Democrat to independent. Don't really like Trump, but don't really like the Democrats either. There'd be a lot more people like me if they were seeing what I saw, which was when I was 21, I saw Dave Rubin videos for the first time and Jordan Peterson videos for the first time, and I went, fuck, the left is fucked up. Like I can't identify with this anymore. And I would say that's got to be a much greater impact than, oh, there was a white supremacist Facebook event that wasn't real, and now there's some Antifa there, and they're sowing divisions. It's a legitimate concern. Like, of course it's a concern that Russia is trying to sway our elections. I just think it's a bigger concern that the biggest company in America is also doing the same, and that company is Google.
So this actually brings up another great reason why I think these companies are very fundamentally broken, and if anything might just be propped up at this point kind of by the government, in that there is this internet industrial government complex at work. You bring up the point essentially of comparing, let's say, Russian state election interference with U.S. corporate election interference. And I think that's actually a really interesting point, because there is some truth to it in terms of these companies are promoting an agenda, and they're promoting an agenda that isn't necessarily best for the American people. It's best for their own bottom lines. And because of their reach, both within the country and throughout the country, and the powerful algorithms they have, to either suppress content or get rid of it entirely, it kind of creates another form of, say, reshaping culture and reshaping ideology. And I think one place that I would potentially disagree with you is that, if you made a point about, who is actually, being convinced by these videos. And I guess my question back to you is, who is actually convinced by a lot of these woke narrative videos? Like, I think a lot of people.
Oh my God, so many people. All the feminist girls I met in college who they were on BuzzFeed constantly and watching Now This videos on Facebook. Oh my God, the Tumblr feminists have become an entire generation of women. I mean, look, there's lots of wonderful women in this world, including my own girlfriend and my mother. Love them all. But the millennial women, I've always said, to a certain extent, there's a big chunk of them that are just this lost generation. Because when I was going through college, I went to college from 2013 to 2017. I know I've said that a few times on the air, but I'll say it again just to give people context. Freshman year, 2013, senior year, 2017. There was this thing where every girl I knew was on Tumblr and BuzzFeed and Facebook constantly, and Twitter, being inundated with feminist blogs and feminist videos and intersectional theory. And then, of course, they're in college, so they're taking the classes too. And it has created a generation of women. I mean, you are hard-pressed. Find a woman who is college-educated in the United States who is not a feminist. You can do it, but it is incredibly difficult. I mean, at this point, I bet you it's 85-15. That if you have a college-educated woman under the age of, let's say, 35, if she is going to be, she's going to be either hardcore feminist, or then maybe something slightly more near the center. I'm not even, and then conservative, forget about it.
But
That's
is
5%.
That the result of actions by these corporations?
To a certain extent, yes, because I think that if you had people say, anti-feminist, especially women anti-feminist voices. So you have traditional anti-feminist voices like maybe a Ben Shapiro or a Steven Crowder, but those are men. The ones that I think women would really like to see and that would convince them to maybe be a little less interested in intersectional feminism, which I think is just an awful, awful movement at this point. But that's besides the point. The voices that really need to be seen and that are being suppressed in the case of this feminist stuff that I think is extremely effective are actually the women who are anti-feminist. So, most notably, you have somebody like Lauren Southern, somebody like June Lapine, goes by Shoe on Head on YouTube, probably the biggest anti-feminist female voice on YouTube. And I don't know how much Shoe on Head's videos are suppressed. I bet you it's at least a little bit. I know Lauren Southern is heavily suppressed. Granted, I understand that Lauren Southern has done some things that a lot of people in the IDW would call borderline. Borderline, not so much IDW, more so far right. But it's arguable, and we're not going to get into that. I just feel like it's a different discussion. But irregardless, she is one of the biggest anti-feminist female voices on the platform. And she was subjected to systematic suppression. Videos were constantly being deleted. And by the way, Lauren Southern's done a lot of work that is not related to feminism as well, but she's one of those big voices. I'm struggling to think of, I know there are other ones. There are all these female voices. Candace Owens, there's a good example. She's anti-Black Lives Matter too, and she's suppressed. She's accused by a sitting U.S. congressman of being a white supremacist. Do you guys see this?
No.
So you have these voices that, it was Ted Lieu in California accused her of being essentially a Nazi. It was ridiculous. I won't get into it, but you could look up Ted Lieu, Candace Owens, if you want to know what I'm talking about. A sitting congressman basically tried to make it seem like Candace Owens, who's a black woman, is a Nazi. But so basically what I'm saying is you have your question, Peter, was how much do I think corporate suppression actually affects, let's say, my cohort that I'm referring to, which is the lost generation of younger, college-educated women. And I actually think it's a lot, because the voices that they're not being exposed to, in many cases, voices they might identify with, such as other women, are being suppressed. Christina Hoff Sommers, great example, because she goes to all of these colleges and gets protested and thrown out of the room. It's like these suppression methods, which, the college one isn't necessarily a tech example, but there are some examples. So, for instance, I bet you, I don't think Christina Hoff Sommers has her own YouTube channel. I think she operates with American Enterprise Institute, but that channel's probably being suppressed. Like I don't put anything past them.
So actually, I think this kind of my next logical question is, okay, so you're saying a lot of people have been influenced, a whole generation of people has been very strongly influenced in their ideology. Yeah.
They're being fed one narrative very heavily, and then the other side of the narrative is being completely eliminated from their feed.
So given that, kind of the assumption there is that people can be very influenced by what they see on YouTube. So they need to be very careful about what YouTube allows, which should also include ISIS videos, Nazi videos, white supremacists, and that perhaps what you're saying actually is we need to suppress way more content than we currently are because apparently we're so easy to brainwash.
No, I think that
But the claim that you made was that these people were exposed
heavily
to this
influenced, yes,
by the choice of the corporate actors, and so we need to further restrict people so that they're not influenced by SJW stuff or by Nazi stuff, which they're doing a good job of suppressing the Nazi stuff.
I think that's twisting a little bit. I think it's just taking a turn that I don't necessarily intend to take. So the starting point that you're starting with, let's start there, is you're saying that my point was people are heavily influenced by this feed that is being curated by the corporations, and that curation influences them politically, often not for the best.
Right.
So that much is true. What I wouldn't say is that all of a sudden we need to suppress more. I think that we need to carefully parse out what we are suppressing and make it very objective, i.e., so if you're a terrorist organization, you are existing unlawfully to begin with. If you are ISIS, if you are the Ku Klux Klan, I believe the KKK is a terrorist organization, aren't they?
Are they classified? I'm not sure if they're classified.
They definitely were at some point, yeah. but they're obviously they're close to it if they're not.
Sure.
Antifa should be a terrorist organization as far as I'm concerned. These organizations that are declared unlawful in their mere existence, particularly ISIS, they can totally be suppressed, but on an objective basis, which is that their existence is unlawful. So of course they can't. You know what I mean? It's like for the same reason that I think that if you're, convicted of a capital crime, like I don't think that Ted Bundy's not still alive. Ed Kemper is a serial killer. If he was posting YouTube videos from jail, just talking about his crimes and potentially getting more people interested in serial murder, which for the record, Ed Kemper probably wouldn't do if you've seen his fictionalized depiction on the show Mindhunter. It's not really in his personality type. But anyway, say he did. Say he did do that. He's posting these videos saying like, oh yeah, I killed all these women. It was so great. Let me tell you about it. I think that YouTube maybe would be able to say like, okay, this is a convicted felon. Like these are people that lose other rights, so we can take away this right. Like if I'm establishing that there's a right to this platform, there are always people who can forfeit those rights, i.e. a convicted felon or an organization, the mere existence of which is unlawful to begin with. So ISIS would never be allowed, in my model, to produce any content at all because they're a terrorist organization. They are
how do you
illegal.
Stop them?
Well,
you find their videos and you ban them.
But it's not ISIS@gmail.com that's posting these videos.
I'm sure they have very sophisticated methods. You work with the FBI.
I think this is the challenge where these videos are getting uploaded at such a massive scale and scope that it's unpoliceable. And so while I sort of agree with that, I don't think it's grounded in the reality of these platforms. And I still want to go back to the point that I made earlier in terms of how. And this is something that we're still studying and still trying to figure out, like how brainwashable are people. And it seems like part of the problem we're facing is that turns out a lot of people can be brainwashed pretty easily, whether it's by, say, these radical feminist videos or by some other set of videos. And if that's the reality of humanity, then I think we really need to rethink the structure and organization of the internet and these platforms.
I agree that there's a lot of influence on these platforms. Again, it's a hard thing to track, but I always favor the sunshine solution or the exposure solution. So on a platform, I think having as many competing ideas as possible available and easily accessible is the best option. Of course, there's curated content, right? So everything's getting filtered into your feed. That's something we can talk about. But the idea that you're on a platform and you're exposed to all these ideas and views is important. However, we're talking about one platform. I'd like to see multiple platforms, not just YouTube, but a political tube. Or there was a site called LiveLeak. I don't know if you guys were aware of this place, but they used to actually post videos from ISIS and videos that had real graphic content, oftentimes police footage or other footage that would have been banned from other platforms. So I think having multiple platforms that is going to have content that is far more controversial, but again, you'd actually have to go to that site to find that content. A more mainstream site like YouTube would, and I agree with this, I think would actually kind of suppress a lot of content maybe that isn't ideal for certain audiences, and you just have a choice of different platforms. But the problem is we're talking about one platform, and in this case, if we're going to accept the idea that it's a monopoly and it needs to be regulated.
It's one platform that runs the show. For video on the internet, it's YouTube or bust.
Well,
that's the thing.
We should probably get into the definition of what a monopoly actually is, right? Okay, so so from my understanding, it's the idea of a single company dominating a market and price gouging, making it incredibly difficult for other competitors to enter the market. So it's like anti-competition or anti-competitive practices, often illegal. These platforms like Amazon and Google, they're major companies. They earn their success through, customers loving what they're doing, what they're offering. There's no real price gouging because it's all voluntary. You can jump on the platform. You can, really only advertisers are the main revenue source. So
I don't think you have to engage in anti-competitive practices to be a monopoly by definition. I think that is the reason that there are antitrust laws. Like the reason that we use monopoly as a legal term and that we have antitrust laws to deal with them is because they engage often in anti-competitive practices. But by definition, you're still a monopoly. You still have a monopoly, even if you don't necessarily engage in anti-competitive practices. As long as you have a large enough market share, you by definition have a monopoly. And in this case, they don't necessarily engage in anti-competitive practices. Maybe they do, but I don't really know a lot about that on Google's end. What they do engage in is election meddling and suppression of free speech in the world's greatest public forum, which is YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. You combine the three, that's where most of the political discussions take place now, whether you like it or not. That's where our discourse is. And they have all the chips. They have all the power.
Yeah, I think that's a major problem, and you have, especially since they're global in nature. They're not just limited to the United States. So maybe a related question to this that came up while we were talking is, so how much of an obligation, let's say, we have to the rest of the world? Let's say, protesters in Hong Kong or potentially other countries where they don't have a guarantee of free speech. Are these platforms responsible then to provide them free speech as well?
Yes. I mean, I think that I don't know if YouTube is obligated to provide its services to the citizens of Hong Kong, but it certainly can and should. And then the only thing is, though, China's going to just do what they do, which is just shut down YouTube and give ChinaTube. It's like you have ChinaTube now, and we only play communist propaganda, and that's just how that ends up working, right? My understanding is that, if you use, a VPN or whatever in China, I mean, I don't really know. I'm not really a tech guy. But if you do something sophisticated enough, you can get Google in China. You just have to do illegal piracy stuff. Because what they do is instead of Google, you get fucking China Google, which is, it's a different, I forget what it's called.
Baidu.
But what is it called? Yes, Baidu. Yes. I've heard that name. That's right. That's it. So you get a different one that is heavily censored. So that's the way that those governments work around that. I don't know if we're obligated to work around that workaround. Yeah. But, so I think that's just kind of how that plays out is we can and should provide freedom of speech to as many people as we can across the world. Fuck countries that don't give their citizens freedom of speech. Yeah. Fuck countries that don't give their citizens freedom of speech. I'll say it twice because I really mean it. It's fuck them. We're going to give them freedom of speech. But of course, those countries are just going to unilaterally be you have Baidu, you don't get Google. Fuck you.
Yeah, I think it's, the way you bring it up too is with regards to other countries and free speech. I think there's this element of what does free speech mean on the internet? And we haven't really legislated that. And it's, let's say you had some ideas and you sent them to a newspaper and then the newspaper decided not to publish it. Was that a denial of your free speech? And is that the model of the internet? Or the future of the internet, certainly not the present of the internet, where, if the New York Times editorial board says, your op-ed just, is a little too white supremacist-y, then we're just not going to publish it. And they used to be kind of these gatekeepers preventing people from reaching a mass audience. And now there's no longer those gatekeepers. And so something does seem to be fundamentally different, where I think we do need to think very carefully about what we mean by free speech on the internet.
So you're kind of getting into publisher versus platform territory. And this is something we've all been learning about now that we're in these free speech tech censorship battles. Is publisher versus platform. The New York Times is not engaging in any kind of violation of, civil or criminal law when they deny somebody an op-ed in the paper. However, they are engaging in libel if they publish an op-ed and it has libel in it. They are a publisher. They curate content, and so they are considered responsible for what they publish. YouTube and Google and Facebook and Twitter are starting to act an awful lot like publishers, and they're an awful lot like newspapers because they deny people op-eds or video essays or tweets. They rip Andy Ngo off the platform. They rip Sargon of Akkad off the platform. They rip Steven Crowder off the platform. They're acting like publishers. And yet, what they want to say is what they always say is, we want to be a platform. Please don't make us, legally liable for any slander or libel or terrorism or anything on our site. Please, 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 we're a platform. But we're going to curate all our content really, really carefully with a political agenda. No, you're a fucking publisher now. And so it's like we need to, promote them to that level and make it so that they are a little bit more scrutinizable and maybe a little bit more regulatable, because you can regulate newspapers to a certain extent in that people can sue the New York Times for the content that they are putting out there if the content violates U.S. law. You can't sue YouTube because the Christchurch shooting video made its way onto YouTube for 20 minutes. You can't sue YouTube. But you know what? The way they're acting is like a publisher. So it's like they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, and what's also not clear is obviously the contract, right? Nobody actually reads the contract. They don't read the license of terms. A lot of people are doing work on creating videos that explain what's happening. But I think if it's very clear what we're getting and what we're buying into with these platforms, that's the first step. Because if it is a platform, then what are the rules? What are we signing up for? And then that way we can move forward. But if it's arbitrary, I don't know. I think there are legal implications for creating a contract that's very vague, and you'd have to go to court to actually figure out what the language means, right?
Well, corporations write the laws anyway.
Yeah.
So I wonder, is the term platform just something that Google and Facebook invented to reclassify
I actually
themselves
don't
not as
know.
publishers?
I'm not well educated enough on this topic.
When you bring up the utility answer, right, or the utility question of classifying them as utilities, so like utilities, are kind of theoretically platforms in some sense.
For existence. Like you need electricity and water.
Right, you need electricity and water and sewage and all that.
For existence.
And so they're kind of public services that are offered sometimes through semi-private or publicly guaranteed companies. And I think it's, we have these two models of publishers and utilities. And like you said, Scott, they want to potentially create this third alternative that has, let's say, all the benefits of both, right? Where they have all the rights and none of the responsibilities. And I think, I think they're trying to do the impossible, where I think they will inevitably end up as either utilities, as you proposed, or as publishers. And we're kind of in this intermediate stage of trying to figure that out. But I don't think there is necessarily a third alternative to that. The one where they can continue to be $1 trillion organizations and
have no fucking responsibilities.
And have no responsibilities to American interests or just the general truth-seeking endeavor of humanity.
It's Uncle Ben from Spider-Man. They've got all this power. It comes with responsibility.
Yeah, but to push back to your point again, and I really want to emphasize this because it's important to me. If we say that they are public utilities, are we not giving up the idea that there could be competition in this marketplace online?
You can have competition between utilities. Doesn't BG&E compete with ComEd?
So do we want competition?
I think we want competition in this market.
Like the platform is, the idea behind a platform is sort of inherently, this is non-competitive, right? The idea is that this is something that you are entitled to as, say, being a citizen of the United States. It's not, you can't really have an alternative to that. It's like, this is our public forum. that we have created, and you are entitled to this public forum. Like, why would we want or need multiple ones? Like, the idea is, well, you just have one, and this is what everybody is guaranteed the right to.
I don't see why we can't have multiple. I'm not saying we need 100, but I'm saying to have.
We don't have multiple Congresses, right? Like, I don't.
But you do have multiple utility companies.
Not that you can choose generally.
Yeah, especially if you're in a specific area, you may only have one choice. Often,
I mean, for phone,
or two choices.
Right? For phone and internet, there's
I have
at
no
least
choice.
3.
Well, I have no.
I guess it is
choice.
difficult. I did. So where I'm from, in the Mid-Atlantic, you can have Comcast or Verizon pretty easily. You can choose between the two. At least where I was from.
Okay, so you have a choice between oligopoly and monopoly. Like, it's almost it's a trivial choice. Like, it isn't like you say.
But I mean,
you
hey,
have two
if
choices.
YouTube gets cut in 2, that's infinitely more competition than none. Like,
but I don't think so. Not in any meaningful way. I think
YouTube versus fucking Vimeo. Like, if Vimeo was bigger and they were more, or what's it? There's a competitor to YouTube that's more free speech oriented. I forget what it's called, but maybe it's BitChute. That's it.
That's
BitChute.
right.
So say like BitChute was a lot bigger, and they're like the Gab of video. So Gab is like Twitter with free speech, and also unfortunately, what inevitably comes with free speech, which is all the like white supremacists going to Gab. But BitChute is the same thing, except I don't know if they have the same problems with like hate speech. But it's like there's a competitor to YouTube. Now, of course, BitChute probably gets 1/100,000th, if that, the traffic of YouTube. Like, it is not a legitimate competitor, but it is the closest thing, I think.
But I guess I don't see the
So what if it was
benefit of
bigger?
having competing forums for public discourse.
But there are already competing forums for discourse all throughout our country, right? There's different political forums. There's different social forums.
Facebook competes with Twitter.
But I mean, none of them are these utilities. Right. I think it's like once you have the utility, like, why would you need competing utilities? What benefit would you get from that? Anyway, like I said, it's not clear to me. I don't particularly have a strong opinion one way or another. I think the more important question is, you can have competing publishers, or you can have sort of these monopolistic utilities, and like kind of those are the two competing models that we seem to be on the track towards.
Yeah. The other danger I'm thinking about is during the 2008 election, I supported Ron Paul, right, for the election. Now, he had massive crowds at the time, and if you go on the network channels, ABC, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, very little coverage, right? This was something that Jon Stewart brought up on The Daily Show. He's like, yeah, this is odd that you're actually being excluded from polls and graphics and all this content. And it was online that people actually found a way to his videos and to his rallies, and you'd see thousands of people.
Sounds like an Asian gentleman who's running in 2020, Andrew something.
Yeah, I mean,
sounds very, very. It sounds like this has been going on for a long time.
Exactly, but if we're talking about these cable companies, these are regulated in such a way that you could only see certain content, and with the internet, this kind of Wild West was a way you could meet with people and talk about.
And it's given life to. You mentioned Ron Paul, I mentioned Andrew Yang, Bernie Sanders to a certain extent. His campaign really, I think,
people said that.
Existed off the backs of the internet and young people. I think like a huge proportion of his staff was under the age of 40, an unusual proportion.
So are you concerned that if we were to treat these as public utilities, that they would not just become legacy media?
Well, the legacy media are not utilities. They are, at the end of the day, they're unregulated. I mean, they are partially regulated media entities, but they're capitalistic enterprises. They're for profit.
But you still
with
need
the exception
a license.
of PBS.
But you still need a license to get on these.
Maybe you should need a license to have a tech company with over $1 billion in revenue. Like, maybe if you have enough revenue for your company, and this is the Elizabeth Warren model, as I understand it. And I'm trying to be open-minded here. Like, I'm trying to give Liz Warren some credit. I'm not a fan of hers. But I'm going to give her some credit, because she was basically saying that her laws would go into effect once you reach a certain amount of revenue. I think it's like if you're a $1 trillion company or something like that, which I think it's right now it's just like Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook are all like $1 trillion companies. And she said, if you are a $1 trillion company, you get broken up. Like, once you're eventually just big enough that we're going to, break you up. And we're going to regulate you some more, and we're going to make you effectively a utility. Now, Elizabeth Warren doesn't have any kind of free speech angle. She doesn't really talk about that because...
But it would solve the election influencing, because if you like if you try to influence the election, let's say by, starting a podcast with 300 subscribers, then it's it's operating at a totally different scale than hundreds of millions of people that are being reached by YouTube and curated by essentially a private board of directors interested in their own shareholder value.
It certainly evens the playing field a little bit.
Just in general, I think it can. It's one of her policies that I would say I'm more in support of than others. And I think, Jack, too, you raised an interesting question in terms of, are these companies kind of doomed to become just legacy media companies? Yeah, sure. Why not? Like we'll look for something new afterwards. I mean, I'm kind of, I think there are a lot of people who are still these tech utopians that can think, oh, well, we can just innovate our way and disrupt our way out of kind of these old problems. It's like, no, the innovators and disruptors, they've, become the tyrants that now need to be, disrupted.
I think that we can have a movement and maybe legislate our way out of it. And what I mean by that is maybe you have like an internet free speech bill of rights or something. I think that we can actually create a new standard. Like America has been so successful as a nation in part because we created a really interesting system with checks and balances. And if you actually think about the Constitution and the things that those men wrote, it's incredibly sophisticated and incredibly smart. And yes, it borrows from, Greco-Roman models to a certain extent. But still, originality aside, a really great system that has been very, very successful almost 300 years on. Those founding fathers established these standards that helped create a functional society, i.e., freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press, and those have been fundamental to our success as a society. There's a new society that has come into existence. There is a whole new realm of existence that is coming to existence in the 21st century. It's called the internet, and we need to change the way we live based off of this thing. The world post and pre-internet is so fundamentally different that I think that we could maybe say that if we want to, because I like the idea of maybe we do make the new social utilities and social media platforms fundamentally different and we make them not have the same flaws that the legacy media has at this point by establishing a new standard for their conduct.
So I think I would present a challenge here, and I think this is just a very kind of fundamental, almost existential challenge to the ideas of these freedoms. Look at China. Look at China and their economic success. I mean, you can argue about their policies. They've done certainly some terrible things.
Successful? Like, are their citizens reaping the benefits of
they
their
have
economic
they have
success?
lifted more people out of poverty. I mean, it has been the single greatest poverty eradication exercise in the history of humanity. I mean, the number of people who've gone from just living in abject poverty to living global middle class standards is really remarkable. So kind of credit where credit's due. They've done that through very authoritarian means. They have done that through a lot of spreading a lot of ideas that reject Western values. And yet they are getting rich, very stable, and without these freedoms. And so you say, well, America was successful based on these values. And now there's this alternative system. You can make a moral case and say, well, though this alternative system does not meet with our morals, and therefore we can never accept it. But I think other countries are increasingly looking at the Chinese model and saying, you know what, you can go through this messy process of speech and all that, or you can just say, nope, government controls what you can and can't view on the internet.
How many children you can have.
And so that's potentially the worry that I see of, I'd say, going very far down the regulation and utility route, where if you make them utilities, if you say have the Federal Bureau of Facebook and Google content, right? I mean, even just saying that sounds remarkably dystopian and 1984, but when you create them, when you make a utility, that's what's going to happen. I mean, you're going to have Department of Education, you're going to have Department of Defense, you're going to have Department of the Internet. And, while that may start out with potentially, say, pro-freedom ideas and ideals, as soon as you start saying, well, we're going to regulate all these things, kind of the bureaucratic machine takes over. And I see that future, I'd say, potentially looking more like the Chinese model than your Internet Bill of Rights model.
I think that's a legitimate concern. And I'd say the answer to that also comes from our tradition as Americans, which is you'd have to create a system of checks and balances. I mean, any new, bureaucracy you're going to create, any new government actor has to be well regulated itself by either private interests or democratic interests through elections. I mean, maybe, I know we don't elect the head of the FCC. Maybe we should. You know what I mean?
Actually, that's not a
Ajit
bad
Pai,
idea.
like he wouldn't have won re-election. You know what I mean? Like he's an appointee, but maybe now that communication is such an important aspect of what we do, the Federal Communications Commission should have an elected position on top.
Do you think that would resolve the regulatory capture that is so commonplace and that causes so many of these problems in the first place?
What exactly do you mean by regulatory capture?
Regulatory capture is essentially when the corporations are involved in writing the laws. It's they would lobby the state.
It so would. Yeah. Because all you have to, so right now the process for that's a really interesting question. So the process for that, as I understand it, Jack, is simply if you're a company and you want to engage in regulatory capture, all you have to do is go to the person who appoints the regulators, in this case Donald Trump, or a few years ago Barack Obama, and just be like, hey, put our guy in. We like Ajit Pai because he's going to get rid of net neutrality. He's our guy. If you make it an electoral system, it becomes a lot harder. Then you have to get real creative, like Google has gotten, and you got to start saying, then you have to start suppressing all of the or all of the pro net neutrality voices, which is much harder and was incredibly difficult for Ajit Pai. I mean, he didn't even attempt to do so, to my knowledge. He did not attempt to suppress, the opposition to his policies. But, that's sort of an unintended benefit of the system I present, because I was not aware of that kind of concept. But yes, I think that it would really help with that a lot.
And I think that would bridge the gap between, maybe a progressive viewpoint and a more strict constitutionalist point of view, because a lot of constitutionalists or libertarians believe that a lot of these agencies shouldn't even exist in the first place, right? But if there was an amendment to the Constitution and these became solidified as part of the state, then we had a vote on it, like you're saying.
We have direct democracy.
Yeah. That actually brings up a really, really interesting idea. So one, I mean, there's definitely elements of, especially what you were saying, Scott, in terms of, Elizabeth Warren's, say, anti-corruption task force, which is another thing which it's one of those where I'm like, I disagree with her about a lot of really fundamental stuff, but I'm like, you're talking about a lot of the really right things. I just disagree with your solutions.
Well, her motives are bad, is the irony. Is like, she's doing all the right things for the wrong reasons.
And but Jack, I think your idea of electing more officials, I think is really, really important, because especially with the executive branch, right? You elect the president, and the president gets the power to appoint all of these people. And we elect the Congress, and we're electing far more people on a much more local level, where we can get rid of bad people much faster. Whereas we have to hope the president picks good people and that keeps tabs on them. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is due to the growth of the responsibilities of the executive branch, particularly, say, with regards to national security or regulation of FCC and other organizations. And I think this is actually a really interesting point in terms of the voters don't have enough say on a lot of these bureaucrats. And you kind of just have to trust the president. And now it kind of makes the presidency such this giant high stakes election. It's like, oh, is it going to be my guy or my girl or whatever? And if anything, it fuels potentially even more divisiveness, because you're like, oh, well, I just hate, Barr, or somebody. It was like, I hate one member of the cabinet, but I'm kind of okay with everything else that Trump's doing, right? And so if you have that idea, if you could go and just vote out the person that you're like, no, this is a corrupt motherfucker, I need to shut him down. You can do that. But now, right now you just have to hope that, the complex system of, incentives and politics that, the president is trying to manage works out in your direction.
Is it a slippery slope, though, if we get to the point where, like, okay, we vote for the chairman of the SEC, which would be really interesting, and, like, net neutrality would never have been repealed if that were the case, if that was an elected position, not in a million years.
Yeah.
But then, I guess my fear would be like, okay, there is a certain assumption when you vote for the president that you're going to entrust him to have a cabinet that serves at his pleasure, which is confirmed by the Senate, and that's the check. Would we maybe, if we're going with this idea of we're going to elect the chairman of the FCC and certain regulatory agencies, are we going to end up electing our Secretary of State? Are we going to end up electing all 9 Supreme Court justices? Like, where's the line that we draw where it's like, okay, not everything is elected?
It's an open question.
Yeah,
I'm not a
yeah. That's kind of a whole nother podcast
scholar.
Yeah.
But I think it is a sort of at its core. I think the expansion of the executive branch the executive branch has expanded far beyond sort of what it was originally designed for, as say, the president is our commander in chief and has kind of some limited executive, domestic executive responsibilities. But it's like now actually he's responsible for the oversight and the creation of this giant bureaucracy, and it's a very different sort of branch of government than what was originally designed, and the checks clearly aren't stringent enough.
And actually, for those who are interested, the rise in the popularity of the term deep state, I think that's part of the cause of this, because this is a term that goes back, coined by political scientists, I think in the 70s, maybe the 80s, and it refers to all the unelected intelligence officials and the military generals who wield an enormous amount of power in our government.
Does that include corporate entities as well? Because they have a lot of power, and
there's a revolving door between.
It may be private military companies are part of this as well. So I think that's the term where it originated. Today, it's become angled for whatever cause you're trying to serve. But I think that's an idea, and that's a concern people have had for many years, that unelected officials via the executive branch have become far too powerful and unaccountable.
So I think, going back to, say, regulating the internet, I mean, I think if we could vote for who is in charge of regulating the internet, I would be actually much more comfortable with the idea of regulation, because then it's not just, whoever's in the revolving door at the time at Google or Facebook who gets to serve at this position because of lobbying or connections or kind of whatever
being a
reasons.
Ruthless CEO.
Yeah, being a ruthless
working
CEO.
their way up like Bill Gates did.
And not to disparage all of those people, I think there are a lot of very smart, very talented people who have done that, and who I would support in terms of actually overseeing the industry that they were formerly or potentially still currently a part of. I just want the chance to vote them out. Like I want that choice.
So I have a new life goal. And that's to be the first ever chairman of the internet. I know. I think that would be such a cool
Chairman
job.
Scott.
I'm the chairman of the internet. But no, yeah, I mean, I joke, but like, I'm intrigued. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, maybe you'd have a better name than chairman of the internet, but chairman of the Internet Commission. There's a small improvement just to start. But it's like, yeah, I mean, let's democratize the internet in the most direct way possible, which is create democratic positions that are voted in to regulate the internet, giving people direct control.
I would love to see more candidates campaigning and
about memes. Because there was Article 13. There was a thing in Europe where they are now regulating memes really heavily. I think for copyright reasons. It's like these things need to be addressed by our legislature and by our executive branch and our judiciary, and we should have a greater say in that, because the internet as a concept is inherently democratic. And so if we're going to have democratic institutions for the internet, they should be directly democratic, small d, as in voting needs to take place.
So I would actually push back a little bit on that. I think the internet is making us realize once again what are the problems of direct democracy, and where you have stubborn minorities or tyranny of the majority, and kind of these ideas come up again in terms of okay, so maybe some of these social media platforms originally they were like 60% liberal, but because they were the majority, they're now imposing their tyranny on the conservative minority.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of relearning these lessons about sort of, say, the problems of the most direct forms of democracy and all those checks and balances that we've put in place, both to serve as checks on autocratic tyranny along with tyranny of the majority. So I like this idea of, again, finding more ways, I would say, to reduce potentially the more autocratic executive branch that we have now, and make it more democratic, and make it, again, try to borrow from the best parts of the internet that we're discovering, the parts that are critical of the establishment media and deep state and other organizations that clearly need reform, without also bringing in, say, that mob justice that we're seeing, and especially when it's a relatively small majority in support of those views that just gets to become tyrannical.
Yeah, there are concerns with direct democracy, and I guess a point that I've kind of ignored up to this point is that we were not founded as a direct democracy. America is not a direct democracy. We were founded very intentionally as a republic, a representative democracy. And I guess we are sort of in a general agreement, at least at first glance, with the idea that maybe the internet calls for moving in the direction of direct democracy, but that there are also certain threats that are posed. But maybe that's the next great adventure of American life, is that the internet has just changed everything. I mean, there was the Industrial Revolution, which changed the way our economy functioned, and then there was the labor movement, and that fundamentally changed existence. Just your day-to-day life in the United States of America and in the Western world. The internet is the new industrial revolution. The Internet Bill of Rights
2020.
movement. The Internet Bill of Rights movement, or the Internet rights movement, could sort of be like the labor rights movement. Like the labor rights movement was to, I would say the Internet rights movement that we're kind of talking about, for lack of a better term. The Internet rights movement is to the internet what the labor rights movement was to the Industrial Revolution. It was like, you know what? We have all these machines that can do these incredible things. Maybe we'll only work 40 hours a week instead of 80.
Yeah. I think
what a fucking wonderful thing. And now it's like we have these new ways of making it so that anyone could have a voice, like a real voice. Like us three schmucks have over 300 subscribers. And thank you to everyone listening for getting us to that point in just 3 short months. We're having a steady growth rate, and we, of course, hope to grow to thousands and tens of thousands and so on. But, us three schmucks can have a voice of hundreds of people listening, and hopefully in the near future, thousands. And that fundamental change, I think, is very akin to being able to work 40 hours a week instead of 80, is the average person could only ever hope to truly influence maybe 10 people in the world, in their immediate family and their very close friends. Now, with a decent amount of effort, we put some work into this podcast, but we now are influencing over 300.
Yeah, I would also, I'd say, I don't actually like the word influence too much. I think that's a little bit more of a nefarious. I think
engage with.
I think the goal
a dialogue
is engaging, and perhaps each of us has our own perspective. Each of us has ideas that we're influenced by, and we kind of take them and filter them through this medium and take feedback back from our listeners. So it's a more dynamic process than just saying, in kind of the old style model, you have this, you have Walter Cronkite or whoever, you have somebody who is saying, this is what it means to be American. And you were influenced by it. You couldn't easily in any way influence that content and what he
it was not a two-way street. It wasn't a two-way feedback system.
And now it's much more dynamic and participatory, rather than kind of this old broadcast media model. And I think, exactly to your point, it's such a transformational event that we've witnessed, both the good and the bad. And when the Industrial Revolution started, it's like, well, you can just work in the factory 100 hours a week. It's like, actually, turns out you will break your back in 15 years, and then be a cripple for the rest of your life, destitute on the street. And it's like, well, we don't want to live in that society. And now
we realize there's just a better way to live.
Yeah, and I think now it's like we have those problems where there are just really terrible videos being disseminated through the internet, kind of reflecting some of the worst aspects of humanity and attempting to influence and spread propaganda. And perhaps we're kind of overreacting to that, and we're still trying to figure out how do we actually make this a better world rather than a just more chaotic or autocratic world.
Yeah, and that's what really fascinates me is how we can make this a better world. How can we, again, maybe not influence, but inform and engage and provoke people to a greater appreciation of different perspectives, right? That's what the IDW is about. and I guess how do we better engage in the world of the internet.
And what we've been discussing, for the past hour or so is what the rules of engagement will have to be. Because, again, Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Everyone on Earth is now empowered by the internet. What a great power we have, and what a great responsibility we have to our listeners as our audience grows, to provide them with not just quality content, but content that maybe is to the betterment of them and the betterment, as I think you were implying, Peter, the betterment of ourselves.
So I think there's also a dark side to this, and as people, as one individual person gets more power, as probably most people have through the internet, it's kind of a little abstract to think about in the internet sense. But let's say like an energy sense, right? Like one person, say with a knife versus a handgun versus an explosive versus a nuke. Right? Like each of those is, say, an increasing amount of power that you can do physical damage with. And I think ideas and the internet similarly give people increasing levels of power. And so maybe we've gone from a world of, well, you used to be, in the hate making weapons analogies. They're just very clear and visceral. It's like, so maybe the internet has taken people from, well, you can get a handgun to like a semi-automatic gun, and it's like you can actually do more.
But a lot of people have nuclear missiles. So like PewDiePie has a nuclear missile. If PewDiePie goes after somebody, he's got 100 million. I'm going to remind everyone, he has 100 million subscribers. He has 100 million people that will follow in his stead. And so what this reminds me of is it's like the nuclear age. I mean, it's like the world realized, like, oh shit, we all have these things that can just end the world at any given moment.
Which is, I think, why we need to be careful.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we really need to think about, I guess I'll put it this way, the thing that has made the nuclear age doable, livable to a certain extent, and tenable is mutually assured destruction. At least that's the commonly pointed to reason. There really isn't mutually assured destruction with the internet. I mean, one person can just dominate and destroy someone else without any real, recourse or justice.
I guess I'm less worried. Well, of course I am worried about particular individuals, but I think it's more, can you, as an individual, like bring the forces, like say collapse the economy of an entire country, and I think it's. I think back to 25 years ago, George Soros breaking the British pound, and it's like remarkable, like what he's got, like financial weapons of mass destruction in a sense, and I think with the nuclear analogy, it's like, well, these powers are going to exist, but like how do we make sure that it is the responsible and competent people who have those powers?
Do we want Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and Susan Wojcicki?
Right.
Do we want those three people socially engineering people?
Unelected individuals who have who essentially are unchecked by society,
who are clearly motivated by money because they're all worth billions of dollars.
Well, hopefully that's all they're motivated by. Like if they're motivated by money, that's really easy.
Rational,
if they are interested in large scale social engineering, I mean there have been some really bad dictators in the world who have been primarily motivated not by money.
They didn't have Facebook,
or
YouTube or Twitter.
So I think when we brought up this idea of, well, we need an elected chairman of the internet, where we need more elections, more checks on these types of power. I think as that power has grown, it's kind of grown in a way that we're subject to it rather than have a check on it, and maybe shifted from a world where it's not sort of a bottom-up government where we grant the government power, but it is the government, the Facebook government, the Twitterati, or whoever, are bearing the power down on us. So I think there is, I think we are in a potentially very autocratic version of the internet age, and I think just given, say, unilateral censorship, and I think we talked about that a lot in terms of we don't really get a say about what gets censored or not. What we think is truth or not, what we think is actually what kind of internet we want to be a part of. It's forced down upon us, and I think that's part of what we're all reacting to cringeworthy, in that we have no recourse, we have no rights. Like it's just this world that is controlled, and that we can't really opt out of.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I think I'm gonna wrap us up for today. I feel like sometimes we're getting to a really interesting point and then we're just kind of out of time. But that was a really great conversation. Peter and Jack, thanks again. This is Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, please subscribe, please comment, let us know your thoughts, let us know what you want to hear about in future episodes. And yeah, we are on YouTube, we are on iTunes, we are on Spotify, we are on Google Podcasts. Let us know what you want to hear, and thanks for listening.